RFR Talk.
This is what it is. This is who I am. This is where I finally take my stand. I didn't want to fall, but I don't have to crawl.
All right, from New York, the belly of the news beast each weekday, normally coming to you from the freedom of the shadow of the Freedom Tower, but today from the underground bunker, as we've been busy collecting and trying to report for you the latest activities of the Supreme Court. Kevin McCullough is my name, and we're always grateful to have you with us. 888-589-8840 is our phone number, 888-589-8840. And we're talking about the Supreme Court cases that got handed down today. There's two. One of them, in my mind, significantly more important than the other, but both of them fairly important. And we're going to talk about both of those with the man whose analysis I began reading as soon as they began being handed down today, and that is the senior or executive editor at hotair.com, Captain Ed Morrissey. He's not really a captain. He just has always been called Captain Ed. But Ed, welcome back. Kevin McCullough, glad to have you with us.
Glad to be with you, Kevin. Thanks for having me on today.
How big of a stake does Hobby Lobby's win in the Supreme Court drive through the forced mechanism of provision for abortions and contraception in Obamacare?
I think it's larger than people think it might be. When you read through the opinion, one of the first things that came out about this opinion today was that, well, it's a narrowly decided case. It's limited to closely held corporations. And it's true that Hobby Lobby and Conestoga are described that way, but the reasoning that went in overturning the HHS contraceptive mandate in these cases, it was not limited to just closely held corporations. In fact, it just upheld corporate rights altogether. And at one point, it addressed how a not closely held corporation would make decisions as to which religious beliefs it wanted to represent, but then said that's not really our concern. There's other precedent that details how corporations make decisions. The issue here is that the RFRA clearly had in mind that corporations were covered under its provisions, and that there wasn't
the
any
RFRA,
restriction
for
on that.
people that are listening and are not clued in, what is the RFRA?
It's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was passed in 1993 on a 97-3 vote in the Senate. I forget what it was in the House, but it was widely bipartisan. But 97-3 in the Senate, and signed by Bill Clinton.
The second of two bills that he signed that I thought were really good, the Defense of Marriage being the first one. But so what we have here is a pretty even broader than what most of the early response about the ruling kind of said. It's a pretty broad win for religious liberties, specifically as they relate to owners and people that operate corporations.
Yes, I think it's a very broad win on a I guess you could call it sort of the entry-level issue here of substantial burden and least restrictive methods of satisfying it. An interesting aspect of this is that, first off, it held that the RFRA did cover corporations, and that therefore there's a high amount of scrutiny that goes on any regulation that arguably impinges on religious expression. What it didn't hold was that the state actually did have a compelling interest in mandating birth control coverage in insurance plans, and that it didn't meet the least restrictive burden. And
now, what does all that mean for people walking down the sidewalk?
Well, basically what this means is that there's still open questions here about the mandate itself. And because in this particular case, it's striking down the mandate from enforcement on Hobby Lobby, Conestoga, other corporations that are similarly postured. They haven't even gotten to the point of talking about the not-for-profit corporations. Excuse me. Like Little Sisters of the Poor would be one, organization.
Right.
Other religious organizations that aren't in that class.
But the likelihood that they decided this way for small corporations, which are for profit and would have greater tax ramification to the revenue base of the federal government, that's got to bode well for nonprofits.
It does in one sense, and here's the question it left open, is that one of the arguments that was presented in this was that because HHS had presented this, remember the accommodation that they made for religious organizations?
Supposed accommodation. It was basically like, do it our way or be quiet.
Right, but they offered this accommodation. What they didn't do is they didn't offer the same accommodation to Hobby Lobby, Conestoga, et cetera. And they said just on the basis of that, you did not apply the least restrictive burden or least restrictive policy to mitigate the substantial burden that this applies to people's religious beliefs. So therefore, it fails the test right off the bat. What they didn't rule is that the accommodation works. And so at first people were saying, well, this is going to bolster the accommodation case, but it actually doesn't. All they said is, you guys offered an accommodation to these other groups. You didn't offer it to these groups. So you're admitting that you didn't use the least restrictive method possible. So therefore, we're going to overturn this.
Well, and they only did the accommodation for the nonprofits because they thought that would that would solve it. I don't think they ever thought for a heartbeat that the Supreme Court was going to decide against them in the for-profit arena.
I don't think they did either, and I don't think that I think they're going to find that the accommodation isn't going to work for the.
No, well, and again, if you use
the
the same basis and reasoning for how they got to this decision, then when you look at the accommodation process, they're not accommodating someone's faith, and nonprofit organizations are by nature much more purpose and ideologically driven in terms of why they exist. That's why in a lot of cases they do things like education and ministering to people that are poor or that have great needs. There's often a moral component to what they do. So again, unless they really, really reverse course, I think that this all does bode well for the accommodation case.
It does. It does, and here's the other part that I think bodes well, is that they found that there was that the HHS mandate does impose a substantial burden on religious expression.
No, you think?
That is an explicit finding in this ruling. Now, the second half of that...
But Ed, come on. That's like waking up and going, the sky is definitely blue.
Oh,
like no one on the planet thought that
they're singing to the choir. I mean, we already know this. But now you have a Supreme Court ruling that establishes this.
Right.
The next step is when you get to these other organizations, the not-for-profits, the religious organizations, is that the government is going to have to prove that they had a compelling state interest, in which the only option was to impose this substantial religious burden. And I don't think they're even going to come close to that. There is no compelling state interest. There is no crisis in access to contraception. People can access it. It's inexpensive. If you are eligible for Title IX, the government covers it for you already. And in fact, that's one of the things that's mentioned explicitly in this opinion too, is that the government could just simply have bought the birth control themselves, rather than force employers to pay for it.
Well, there better be some female legal editors then that contribute for shows like the Today Show better read the entire opinion, because they're on talk radio already saying, oh, this is the employer being given absolute control over my sexual choice.
Oh,
and
it's absurd. It's so absurd. I mean, that has been the talking point since day one. And I've said it before, I'll say it again, the CDC, this is the government's health agency, the CDC, Centers for Disease Control, did a 28-year study of unplanned pregnancy in which a lack of access to birth control didn't even contribute enough to make the list of the reasons why women had unplanned pregnancies.
Right.
99% of all the women who were sexually active and who wanted to avoid pregnancy accessed contraception. There is no crisis. Women have been able to access contraception for decades, ever since, and I'm trying to remember the name of the court case that struck down laws against contraception, but it was in the early 1960s. And ever since 1974, the government has been paying for it through Title IX for women of low income. So there is no crisis.
Yeah,
and
it's a non-argument.
If there was a crisis, there are other ways to address it, as Title IX proves, than forcing employers to pay for it for their employees.
Friends, you're getting an idea of why he's one of the first people I turn to and start to read when it comes to analysis of some of this stuff. Ed Morrissey is with us. And Ed, I think that this is going to bode well. I want to stay on this case for one more second, and then we'll move to the other court case this morning. And I think that there's a very interesting shadow to the decision here that no one's talking about yet, but I've already posed the question on Facebook, and that is this. If it is easy to recognize that owners of at least closely held corporations may have, in fact, religious beliefs that they, in fact, even practice even in their workplace. I think you're beginning to set a precedent here that says an individual's religious belief cannot be obstructed in the doing of their business and other things. And if that's the case, I think you may have an argument against some of the cases, the photographer, the wedding cake, the cupcake maker that have been dragged into court on the basis of discrimination against people that behave in certain sexual ways. I think that there's another round of that discussion that is yet needing to be held, because if you put a burden on someone's faith that taxes it to this degree, you're doing the same thing in those other cases. And I think that somebody's going to go, well, wait a minute. I'm glad to see this, actually, because we've had a long number of months now where you've had sexual rights advocates and religious liberty advocates on a train path headed for a head-on collision somewhere in the middle of the country. And this is the first sign of hope that I've seen that religious liberties are actually still alive.
Well, and I think it's important to note that they were very clear that they were not that the RFRA is one tool in this, but it is not dispositive in all cases. I mean, the RFRA is there to make sure that when you have a government policy that substantially burdens religious liberties, that it is the least intrusive method for dealing with a compelling state interest that they have at their disposal.
Right.
And that's a case by case. That is a case by case basis. And so you can still bring actions against people, but the people that you bring actions against do have the RFRA as part of their defense.
And that got strengthened today by this ruling.
And that's what you have here is the RFRA, and this is all about the RFRA.
Yeah, they strengthened that position legally. They made the RFRA mean something more today than it has in the past.
Immensely so, yes.
Yeah, okay, that's good. That's good. Ed, let's talk about the Harris v. Quinn case. This is a very interesting case that affects conservatives and Christians and free market people all across this country. But what did the court find in Harris v. Quinn?
Now, this is really interesting because I actually think that this might be more important about the limitation of government power than Hobby Lobby was, because, well, at least at a certain level, what happened in Harris has also happened in Minnesota, which was that the state government was making arguments that when people hire personal assistants, private care assistants, home health care assistants,
right,
using state subsidies in order to partly pay for that those employees become state workers for the purposes of collective bargaining, which means basically for the purposes of harvesting cash from them for out of union dues or agency fees, and the workers in the state of Illinois, led by Pam Harris, challenged that ruling, and they lost at the federal district court, and they lost at the appellate court, and so they were being forced to pay funds to a union, even though the union didn't represent them in collective bargaining because they weren't working for the state. They were working for the individual to whom they were providing the care, or the family to whom they were providing the care. So the union didn't have any room to do anything for them anyway, but they were forced to being paid at least agency fees, if not full membership fees. And so the Supreme Court took a look at that today and said, this is ridiculous. You can't. These are not state employees for the purposes of the precedent cases called Abood, where the agency fees can be forcibly collected. And so the ruling is saying there's a limit to what you can claim as a state employee. Not everybody who gets a subsidy for that goes into their salary is a state employee, regardless of however you want to use sophistry to make that argument. It doesn't apply. And so this is a big blow to the public employee unions who were hoping to get a large and basically effortless avalanche of extra funding from thousands of people who were working in private homes who were being hired by private individuals.
Right, and they were going to
being
figure
requested by
out,
state employees.
and I'm sure this was just the first stepping stone to figuring out how they could do that, not just in the healthcare industry, but other things that might apply as well. And they did see a big pot of money at the end of the rainbow, so to speak.
Yeah, you bet they did, and it's a big issue here in Minnesota too, because they did the same thing here in Minnesota, and those cases now are likely to be overturned as well.
Yeah, well, if they're identical to this one, it's probably a done deal. Let me ask you something else before we go, because we've got a couple of seconds here. The John Fund did a really interesting piece on Friday for the National Review, and it plays into these two cases, but plays into some cases that were released last week, and that is that for a constitutional professor of constitutional law, this administration, led by the president and the AG, seems to have a very spotty record on understanding what constitutionality is made up of. And in fact, since 2012, they've lost 13 cases by a score of 9 judges to 0. Your thoughts on that? Is just 2 more losses have come in against the administration.
Well, I mean, it's not these aren't even the most brutal of the losses. I mean, the recess appointment.
That was just bad.
Decision on that was the Canning decision. That's certainly a much bigger deal, I think, in terms of because it was unanimous, 9-0.
Yeah.
Don't forget.
But
also
we're short on time,
exception.
Ed. Do all of these unanimous losses really mean that the president sees a different constitution when he wakes up in the morning than all the rest of us do?
Well, I think there's a number of Americans that probably applies to.
Okay.
But I think what it means is that he's willing to push the limits to see how far he can expand his power.
Ed, on that note, I got to let you go. But thank you for your effort today. Appreciate it. Yeoman style. Hotair.com, Ed Morrissey. I'm Kevin McCullough. Coming right back.